So, as we have already discussed in these videos, the Elizabethan era is considered one of the most influential times in theater history. But for all the advancements that were made, and for all of the voices that were now being heard, let's be honest, the reason we remember this time period is because of one man, and that is William Shakespeare. And because William Shakespeare's name kind of rose through the ranks and became the most profitable, the most popular, and ultimately the name that survived history, we tend to forget that just because William Shakespeare was the most identifiable playwright of the Elizabethan era, that doesn't mean he was the only playwright of the Elizabethan era. What we're going to be taking a look at in this video is a couple of other playwrights who were making their mark around the same time, one of whom people believed is actually the superior writer to Shakespeare, and many historians would back up the claim that had he not suffered an untimely death, it'd be his works that we would be talking about primarily in high schools and universities. So let's take a look. So the first Elizabethan playwright that we are going to discuss is this gentleman, Ben Jonson. Ben Jonson is notable, if for no other reason than he is the lone Elizabethan playwright who stuck with the neoclassic principles in his own work. As we've discussed, all of the other playwrights from this time period pretty much rejected the neoclassical ideas, but Ben Jonson still liked them and still utilized them, at least for the most part. His plays did include subplots and side stories, which, as we know from the Three Unities, the neoclassics would not have approved of. So even he bent the rules a bit, but he still adhered to them much stronger than any of his compatriots. He's also well known for developing what we would call a comedy of humors. Now, what this means is that each of his principal characters had an excess of one specific personality trait, also called a humor. The best way to describe this is think of it like the characters from the Commedia dell'arte. Think of things like Pantalone, who was a lecherous, greedy old man, so he would have an excess of lust or greed. Capitano would have had an excess of cowardice. Or Dottore would have had an excess of stupidity. So each of these characters are known for one distinguishing character trait that's basically turned up to 11. So that is what it means when we say that his characters had an excess of a specific humor. As we look at the career of Ben Jonson, we see that he had a fairly turbulent playwriting stint. He began as an actor and then eventually a playwright for a company known as the Admiral's Men, which was named for Charles Howard, who was originally the first Earl of Nottingham, but then was eventually promoted to England's Lord High Admiral, and he became their sponsor, hence the name the Admiral's Men. Almost from the beginning, it seemed like Jonson was destined to run into trouble. The very first play that he co-wrote, a play called The Isle of Dogs, he and his partner were actually arrested because someone in the government took great offense to the subject matter. So they were both arrested, and Jonson himself was charged with lewd behavior. But this was not his last run-in with the law or with battling other people. He was imprisoned again, this time for actually killing a guy, a gentleman named Gabriel Spencer, in a duel. Later in his career, Jonson actually got into what we could today consider to be a flame war with two critics. His play called Cynthia's Rival had generated ire from these two critics of the time who lambasted Johnson in their various articles. He would then come back and lambaste them in one of his plays. They would then lambaste him in some of their articles, and it went back and forth like this. Ben Jonson had a number of successful plays in his career, but probably the one he is best known for is this one, Every Man in His Humor. And no, before you get confused, this is not a sequel to the morality play Every Man. The plot is a little confusing, but trying to bullet point it down. The play is about a nobleman by the name of Noel. Now, that's not Noel as in Christmas, N-O-E-L. It's Noel, K-N-O apostrophe W-E-L-L. Noel. Noel is concerned that his son is not coming up with moral values. His son is living in the city and is kind of what we would nowadays call a playboy or a man about town. So he sends his servant by the name of Brainworm. So you can kind of see where we're going with these humors and each character having an excess of a specific personality trait. So he sends his servant Brainworm basically to spy on his son, and Brainworm kind of has his own agenda. In the subplot, so again we see the breaking from the neoclassical traditions there. In the subplot, a local merchant is suffering from intense jealousy. So we see again the overabundance of one personality trait, in this case jealousy, that his wife is cheating on him with some of these drunken party boys that his good-for-nothing brother-in-law has brought home. So what I want to illustrate here is, one, notice the characters with the excess of a specific trait. Noel, of course, the desire for knowledge, the merchant with the overabundance of jealousy. And also notice that even though Ben Jonson was famous for sticking to the neoclassical ideas, even he was breaking with them with the fact that he had a subplot going. No discussion of Elizabethan playwrights is complete without discussing this gentleman, Christopher Marlowe. He was one of the most influential playwrights of all time. He was one of the most popular of this time period, and he is the playwright whom I spoke of at the top of the video that most historians believe was actually a superior author to Shakespeare, and had it not been for his untimely death, that he would have risen through the ranks and would today be considered the greatest Elizabethan playwright of them all. So when we say that Christopher Marlowe is one of the most influential playwrights of his time, we mean it in a couple of specific ways. First of all, we know that his work was a heavy, heavy influence on the work of a young William Shakespeare. Marlowe had been writing plays and had been popular in London for a couple years prior to Shakespeare. And at the time, the two of them were actually writing plays simultaneously. Marlowe's plays would fairly consistently outsell Shakespeare's. So he was no slouch. And we know that his writing style and his subject matter would later go on to influence the work of Shakespeare. Marlowe was known for writing very beautiful and very complex dialogue in a style that had not really been seen as poetically as it was since the days of the ancient Greeks. He had a talent for mixing complex writing with really beautiful prose and language. Again, something that a young Shakespeare was going to emulate. Also, Christopher Marlowe, while maybe he didn't invent it, his work is known for starting to take tragedy in a different direction than it had ever been before. Many of his plays dealt with subject matters like the exploration of a personal tragedy of a king. Who had ever heard of that before? Not the large kingdom-destroying tragedies, but the personal tragedies of a king, making a monarch into a human character. He would also deal with topics like the tragedy and damnation of the human soul. He was the one that began the trend of redefining tragedy in the Elizabethan era. So I think we need to take a little pause here in our discussion to talk a little bit about the way the Elizabethans viewed the concept of tragedy. Now, tragedy was still one of the most popular forms of dramatic expression, indeed one of the only, next to comedies and histories. But tragedy was always seen as the high watermark. This is what you wanted to achieve. You wanted to write a great tragedy, because that proved what a brilliant writer you were. But here's the thing. The meaning of tragedy, in terms of what was considered tragic, has shifted a great deal in the centuries separating the Greeks from the Elizabethans. If you recall, way back at those early videos, what the Greeks considered tragic were stories about people who were undone, partly due to their own tragic flaw, whatever that may be, but also through outside forces that were influencing them, pushing them, guiding them. Many of their tragedies dealt with fate and the hands of the gods and things of that nature. Greek tragedies, the characters always felt like they were rats running a maze, and they had no real choice about running the maze, but they were put in there, and that is what they had to do. So that is where the Greek concept of tragedy focused. The Elizabethans had a very, very, very different view. If we look at the plays of the Elizabethans, and once again, yes, I'm sorry, but let's use Shakespeare's plays as the primary example. What we see in their tragedies are not men and women undone by outside forces, but men and women outdone by their own choices. The tragedy in Elizabethan plays comes from the fact that our protagonists, our main characters, have every opportunity with which to change their fate. In just about every tragedy you can think of, the characters always have a moment where they can not take a certain action. Romeo and Juliet could choose not to hide their marriage, or choose not to fake their own deaths, in terms of Juliet's case. Hamlet could make the choice not to seek revenge. In fact, as we will discuss when we get there, that is the entire plot of Hamlet, is him trying to decide, should I do this or should I not? And he goes with, yeah, I'm gonna do it. Macbeth could just have easily not murdered the king. The characters of Elizabethan tragedies have a choice, and they are aware of that choice. Whereas with the Greeks, often because of the focus on fate and divine intervention and things of that nature, the characters think they have a choice, but really don't. As in the case of Oedipus, hearing the prophecy, you will kill your father and marry your mother. With the Elizabethans, the characters always have a choice. And they choose, sometimes with exact knowledge of what will happen, they choose the path that leads them to their tragedy. And that is where the tragedy lies for the Elizabethans. It lies in the fact that these men and women could have made different choices. They could have gone left instead of right. And if they had, things might have turned out better for them. But they make the conscious choice to go the other way with it. If you really look at Elizabethan tragedies, a lot of them are about characters that we would, in modern day, consider the villains, the bad guys. These are plays about people who do horrible, horrible things. And do them for dumb reasons, power or lust or money. And yet they are the center of the tragic story, because the tragedy is how they got there, how these seemingly good people who started out with good intentions made one choice and then another and then another and then another and then another until they were completely lost. Probably the best way to explain tragedy from the Elizabethan era is a quote from Shakespeare's play Macbeth. I'm not going to do the exact quote, I'm going to paraphrase. About halfway through the play, Macbeth says to his wife, he says, "I have waded halfway through a river of blood, and if I'm going to turn back and try to make up for the mistakes that I have made, I'm going to have to walk through just as much blood as if I just keep going and towards the goal that I was heading towards the whole time." And he decides to keep going. So he has that moment, and he recognizes that he could go back. He could try to make amends and could try to make things right. But he's going to end up killing more people and walking through just as much blood as if he kept going towards his ultimate goal, so might as well stay the course. That's the tragedy of the Elizabethans. And that is the tragedy of Christopher Marlowe's most famous character, Dr. Faustus. Dr. Faustus tells the story of an ambitious scholar who feels that he has learned all there is to learn in terms of human knowledge, and desperate to learn even more, he makes a literal deal with the devil. Not in a figurative sense. The devil is a physical character in the show, and Faustus sells his soul for ultimate knowledge. So for more information on Dr. Faustus, check out Storytime with Mr. Lawrence, where I'll walk through the plot in a little bit more detail. Before we go, there are a few things that we need to close the book on in terms of our discussion of Christopher Marlowe. And these are the things I always save for last, because I really dig this. So, as mentioned, had it not been for Marlowe's untimely death at a very young age, many historians believe that it would in fact be his works that we would be studying more thoroughly than we do in high schools and in universities. But I really didn't get into the details of Marlowe's untimely death. Well, to understand that and to understand kind of the legends that have popped up around that death, we also need to understand one other major fact about Christopher Marlowe's life. Christopher Marlowe was a government spy. He was, to use a kind of overdone cliche, he was the Elizabethan era James Bond. Maybe not to that extent, but he was a secret agent. He worked for the government. We have documentation that proves this. His time at university is marred by long absences, week to month-long absences, at the return of which he would come back. And just like when you are absent from school, you have to bring a note from home, or you have an absentee slip that the teacher needs to sign to kind of validate that, yes, you were absent. Marlowe would return with a document with the seal of the Queen on it that would tell the professor in no uncertain terms, don't ask where he was, don't worry about it, just let him keep going. So Christopher Marlowe was, and again this is proven, he was a government spy, as well as being a playwright. Well, one night at a tavern, he was drinking with a bunch of friends. An argument broke out, and Christopher Marlowe was stabbed through the eye socket with a dagger. By some accounts, it says he died instantaneously. Some say that he lingered for about a day before finally dying. But he was killed via dagger through the eye in a bar fight. Now, where do these two stories kind of come together? There are those who believe that this was not a drunken brawl that just kind of sprung up out of nowhere, fueled by drink and ego and temper, that this actually was an assassination attempt. And we'll see a video that goes more into detail on that. But that is something I always enjoy talking about and always enjoy sharing. One of those fun little conspiracy theories that has sprung up throughout theatrical history. And in fact, that conspiracy theory will lead to another conspiracy theory that we will talk about shortly.